At Christmas dinner, my sister slapped my baby. When I called her out, she said I was overreacting, and everyone just sat there in silence. Then my husband, a military commander, stood up, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "Get out." She left that night and never came back. You know, last Christmas, something happened that I still can't quite believe. My sister, Vanessa, slapped my 6-month-old baby right across the face during dinner. Our entire family was there and nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stared like it was perfectly normal. But then my husband, David, he's a military commander, he slowly stood up. And what happened next? It changed everything. Just 3 days later, I uncovered something that made me realize this wasn't just about one awful moment. It was about 28 years of feeling completely invisible in my own family. The Sterling family Christmas dinner was always Vanessa's show, and December 23rd was no different. She rolled up 2 hours late in her white Tesla, dragging in these massive ring lights and a whole camera crew she'd hired. Why? To document her authentic family Christmas experience, for her lifestyle blog, of course. I was standing in the kitchen doorway, gently bouncing Lucas against my shoulder. He was fussing, still waking up from his afternoon nap. I watched my mom, Patricia, literally rearrange our entire dining room to fit Vanessa's filming setup. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey, but underneath it all was that familiar, suffocating tension that came with any Sterling family gathering. My dad, Robert, was in his usual corner chair, glued to his phone, pretending not to notice the chaos. He'd perfected that art of selective blindness over the years, especially when it came to the constant drama between his daughters. Vanessa had been hyping this dinner for weeks, calling it her family gratitude special, and promising her followers an intimate look at holiday tradition. What she conveniently forgot to mention was that David had just returned from a 6-month deployment overseas, or that we'd driven 3 hours from Cedar Falls just to introduce our son to his grandparents for the holidays. None of that mattered when it came to Vanessa's narrative. David emerged from the guest bedroom, where he'd been changing Lucas's diaper. He looked so sharp in his dress uniform. Even off duty, he carried himself with that quiet authority that comes from years of leading soldiers. He caught my eye across the room and gave me one of those small smiles, the kind that silently promises everything will be okay, even when you're not entirely sure it will be. The dining room? It had been transformed into something out of a magazine. Vanessa had moved our grandmother's antique candlesticks for her equipment, relocated family photos for better angles, and even swapped out the napkins for ones that photographed better. She directed her cameraman around the table like she was shooting a commercial, which, let's be honest, she basically was. Mom bustled around her, adjusting everything to meet Vanessa's impossible standards. The turkey, which had been cooling to the perfect serving temperature, was now under heat lamps to maintain its appearance for the cameras. Side dishes were rearranged 3 times. Even the flowers had been replaced with a more photogenic arrangement Vanessa had brought from Portland. I'd learned long ago not to comment. Growing up, I'd made the mistake of pointing out the absurdity more than once, only to be met with lectures about supporting family and understanding that some people had bigger dreams. The implication was always clear. I was small-minded, jealous, threatened by her ambition. David helped me set Lucas in the high chair we'd brought, the same one that had belonged to David's grandmother, Eleanor. It was solid wood, worn smooth by generations of children, and it looked so oddly out of place among Vanessa's carefully curated aesthetic. Lucas gurgled happily, reaching for the colorful toys, completely unaware he was about to become an unwitting part of his aunt's content creation. The meal began with Vanessa's customary gratitude speech, delivered directly to her camera, while the rest of us sat in awkward silence. She droned on about family traditions, togetherness, and how blessed she felt to share these moments with her followers. She managed to speak for nearly 10 minutes without mentioning David's deployment, Lucas's first Christmas, or anything specific about the actual people sitting around the table. When she finally finished and signaled for the filming to pause, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Mom immediately started serving, making sure Vanessa's plate looked perfect before addressing anyone else's needs. Dad emerged from his phone long enough to carve the turkey, though he kept glancing nervously at the cameras. David and I exchanged glances as we tried to navigate eating while keeping Lucas entertained and relatively quiet. The conversation flowed in its predictable pattern. Vanessa dominated, updating everyone on her latest brand partnerships, collaborations, and the exciting opportunities that seemed to just fall into her lap. Mom hung on every word, asking detailed questions about follower counts and engagement rates as if she were receiving a masterclass in digital marketing. I tried to contribute when there were natural openings, sharing updates about our life at Fort Henderson, David's recent promotion, and how we were adjusting to parenthood. But my stories just seemed to disappear into the air, acknowledged with polite nods before the conversation inevitably circled back to Vanessa's world. It was like trying to add ingredients to a recipe that had already been completed and plated. David noticed, of course. He always notices. He made a point of asking me follow-up questions, drawing me back into conversations that had moved on without me. He shared stories about the base community, about the other military families we'd grown close to, about how proud he was of how I'd managed everything during his deployment. His efforts were kind, but they also highlighted how little interest my own family showed in my actual life. Lucas was remarkably well-behaved for a 6-month-old, content to chew on his teething toys and observe all the activity. Occasionally, he'd babble or laugh, drawing brief smiles from around the table before the adult conversation resumed. He was fascinated by the lights from Vanessa's equipment, reaching toward them with that determined focus babies have when something captures their interest. Midway through the main course, Vanessa decided she wanted to film some candid family interaction. She had her cameraman position himself to capture what she called natural holiday moments, though there was nothing natural about performing dinner conversation for an audience of thousands. She directed us to continue eating and talking normally while she provided commentary about the beautiful chaos of family gatherings. This is when things started to go downhill, so gradually that it was hard to pinpoint exactly when the shift occurred. Vanessa had always been particular about maintaining control, but the combination of filming pressures and her usual need to be the center of attention seemed to be escalating her stress. She kept calling for resets when conversations didn't flow the way she wanted, when someone's expression wasn't right for the camera, when background noises interfered with her audio. Lucas, meanwhile, was getting tired. His cheerful babbling had turned into that familiar whimpering, the precursor to a full meltdown. David and I tried to keep him calm with quiet songs and gentle bouncing, but the unfamiliar environment, disrupted nap schedule, and all the unusual activity were clearly overwhelming him. I suggested taking him to the guest room for a few minutes to decompress, but Vanessa immediately objected. She was in the middle of filming what she called the heart of the segment, and having people leave would ruin the content. She assured me that babies were adaptable, that a little fussing was normal, and that we shouldn't let it interrupt the special family time she was trying to capture. Mom agreed, adding that I was being overly cautious and that babies needed to learn to adjust. Dad just nodded along, still not looking up from his plate. David's jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when he was choosing his words carefully in a tense situation. He suggested gently that maybe we could take a short break from filming to let everyone reset. But Vanessa was already pivoting to what she called a more authentic approach. Instead of minimizing Lucas's fussing, she would incorporate it into her narrative about the beautiful messiness of real family life. She began speaking to her camera about how holidays with little ones required flexibility and patience, how the unexpected moments often made the best memories. Lucas's whimpering escalated to actual crying, the kind of tired, overwhelmed sobbing that just breaks a parent's heart. I reached for him instinctively, but Vanessa held up her hand to stop me. She was still filming, still trying to capture what she was now calling an authentic moment of holiday chaos. She seemed to think Lucas's distress was adding authenticity to her content, proof that her family celebrations were real and unfiltered. David's face had gone completely still, the expression he wore when dealing with difficult situations in his command. He was watching Vanessa with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for assessing potential threats. I could see him calculating, weighing options, trying to find the diplomatic solution that would protect his son without creating a larger conflict. I tried again to reach for Lucas, and again Vanessa stopped me. This time she was more direct, explaining that I was being dramatic and that a little crying never hurt anyone. She reminded me that she had experience with children, too, having babysat throughout high school, and that sometimes parents needed to relax their overprotective instincts. Lucas's crying intensified, the desperate wailing of a baby who had reached his limit. The sound filled the dining room, competing with Vanessa's continued commentary about embracing the chaos of family life. She seemed oblivious to the fact that everyone else at the table had stopped eating, stopped pretending to enjoy themselves, stopped participating in her performance. That's when it happened. Vanessa, clearly frustrated that Lucas's crying was overwhelming her audio and disrupting her carefully planned segment, leaned across the table toward the high chair. Her hand moved so quickly that for a moment I wasn't sure what I'd seen. The sharp crack of her palm against Lucas's cheek echoed through the suddenly silent room. Lucas's crying stopped instantly, replaced by a shocked silence that felt like the air being sucked from the room. Then came a wail unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. A sound of pure bewilderment and pain that seemed to pierce straight through to my soul. His tiny cheek was already turning red where she'd struck him. Nobody moved. Mom sat frozen, her fork halfway to her mouth. Dad's eyes were wide with shock, but he remained in his chair. The cameraman kept filming, apparently unsure whether he should stop. Vanessa herself seemed momentarily stunned by what she'd done, her hand still extended across the table. But David moved. He rose from his chair with the controlled precision of someone who had spent years training for high-pressure situations. There was no rush, no sudden explosion of movement, just the deliberate unfolding of a man who had made a decision. His 6'3" frame seemed to fill the room as he stood, his dress uniform making him appear even more imposing in the suddenly silent dining room. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that made people listen without question. "Turn off the camera." It wasn't a request. The cameraman immediately complied, the red recording light disappearing as the room fell into an even deeper silence. David walked around the table to where Lucas sat sobbing in his high chair. He lifted our son with the gentle competence of a father who had comforted him through countless nights, holding him against his chest and murmuring soft reassurances. Lucas's cries began to subside almost immediately, reduced to hiccuping sobs as he buried his face against David's shoulder. Vanessa, David said, his voice still calm, but with an edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. You just struck my infant son. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I need you to explain to me why you thought that was acceptable. Vanessa's face had gone through several color changes, from pale shock to defensive red. He was being disruptive, she said, her voice higher than usual. I was trying to teach him that crying isn't appropriate at the dinner table. Sometimes children need clear boundaries. He's 6 months old, David replied, still in that eerily calm tone. He doesn't understand boundaries. He understands that someone hurt him. He adjusted Lucas gently, checking his cheek where a faint red mark was still visible. And you struck him hard enough to leave a mark. The room remained frozen in tableau, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Mom finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a whisper. Vanessa, honey, you shouldn't have. Don't, David interrupted, not raising his voice, but somehow commanding immediate attention. Don't minimize this. Don't excuse it. And don't you dare suggest that what just happened was acceptable in any way. He turned his attention back to Vanessa, who was now looking around the room as if searching for support that wasn't coming. You are going to pack up your equipment and leave now. And you are not going to come near my family again until you can explain to me how you plan to ensure this never happens again. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. You can't just. I mean, this is my family, too. You can't ban me from family gatherings. Her voice was gaining strength as she spoke, defensive anger replacing shock. You're being completely unreasonable. It was barely a tap. You're acting like I committed some terrible crime. David's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Anyone who had served under his command would have recognized the warning signs. Barely a tap that left a mark on my infant son's face, he said. A tap administered because he was crying, which is literally the only way babies have to communicate distress. He looked around the table, his gaze settling on each family member in turn. And not one of you moved to stop her. Not one of you said a word. You all sat here and watched someone strike a baby, and you're now trying to minimize it because she's family. The truth of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Mom's face crumpled with something that might have been shame. Dad finally looked up from his plate, though he still couldn't quite meet David's eyes. Vanessa's defensive anger was wavering, being replaced by something that looked almost like recognition of what she'd done. But it was too late for recognition. David had made his decision. Natalie, he said, turning to me with an expression that was gentle despite everything. Pack Lucas's things. We're leaving. He paused, looking back at the family that had just revealed its true nature. And we won't be coming back. I stood on shaking legs, my whole body still processing what had happened. Lucas was calm now in David's arms, but I could see the confusion in his wide eyes, the way he kept touching his cheek where Vanessa had hit him. The sight of it sent a wave of protective fury through me that I'd never experienced before. As I gathered our things from the guest room, I could hear voices from the dining room. Vanessa's, raised in what sounded like justification and deflection. Mom's, pleading and conciliatory. David's, still calm but immovable. By the time I returned with our overnight bag, the conversation had ended. David was standing by the front door with Lucas, our diaper bag already slung over his shoulder. His face was set in the expression I'd learned meant the discussion was over and the decision was final. Vanessa stood near the dining room doorway, her face blotchy with tears and anger, while Mom hovered nearby, wringing her hands. This is insane. Vanessa called out as we headed toward the door. You're destroying our family over nothing. Over absolutely nothing. He's fine. Look at him, he's not even crying anymore. David stopped at the threshold and turned back one final time. The fact that you think striking a baby is nothing tells me everything I need to know about your judgment, he said. And the fact that the rest of this family is willing to excuse it tells me everything I need to know about their priorities. He opened the door and gestured for me to go ahead of him. As we walked toward our car, I could hear Mom calling after us, begging us to come back, to talk this through, to not let one incident ruin the holiday. But David's stride never faltered, and neither did mine. We drove home in silence, Lucas sleeping peacefully in his car seat, his cheek now bearing only the faintest pink mark where Vanessa had struck him. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw still set in that grim line that meant he was working through something difficult. It wasn't until we were safely back in our own home, Lucas fed and settled in his crib, that the full weight of what had happened hit me. I sat on our couch, still wearing the dress I'd chosen carefully for Christmas dinner, and began to cry. Not just for what had happened that evening, but for all the years of feeling invisible, dismissed, and overlooked by people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. David sat beside me and pulled me close without saying anything. He understood that sometimes there were no words adequate for the situation. That sometimes comfort was just about being present and steady while someone processed their pain. I'm proud of you, I finally whispered against his shoulder. For what? For standing up. For protecting him. For not letting them minimize what happened. I pulled back to look at him. I don't think anyone has ever defended me like that before. His expression softened in a way that was reserved just for quiet moments between us. That's what family does, he said. Real family. They protect each other. They don't excuse abuse, and they don't ask you to tolerate the intolerable for the sake of peace. Later that night, as I lay awake replaying the evening's events, I realized David was right about more than just that moment. This hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the culmination of a lifetime of experiences with people who demanded my silence, my accommodation, my willingness to accept less than I deserved. But this time had been different. This time, someone had stood up. Someone had said no. Someone had made it clear that the behavior was unacceptable and that there would be consequences. And as I drifted off to sleep next to my husband with our baby safe in the next room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my family. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the solid peace that comes from knowing your boundaries are respected and your worth is recognized. What I didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The events of that Christmas dinner would set in motion a series of discoveries that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my past, and my own strength. But for that night, it was enough to know that someone had finally stood up for what was right. The real war would begin 3 days later. David was feeding Lucas his morning bottle, and I was staring at the untouched Christmas presents still wrapped under our tree. My phone rang. It was Mom. Her voice sounded strained, almost breathless, as if she'd been rehearsing what to say. "Natalie, honey, I know you're upset, but we need to talk about what happened. Vanessa feels terrible about the whole thing. She didn't sleep at all last night. She wants to apologize properly, but she can't do that if you won't answer her calls." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, looking across the kitchen at David, who was watching me with concern. Lucas made happy gurgling sounds as he drank, completely unaware of the tension crackling through the house. The red mark on his cheek had faded to barely visible, but I could still see it if I looked closely enough. "Mom," I said finally, my voice tight. "She hit my baby. She struck a 6-month-old child because he was crying. I'm not sure what there is to discuss. She barely touched him, Natalie. You're making this into something much bigger than it was. People make mistakes when they're stressed. You know how important her work is to her, and having the filming disrupted her." I interrupted, feeling heat rise in my chest. "Mom." She slapped Lucas across the face because he was interfering with her social media content. "Do you hear how that sounds?" Mom's sight came through the phone like static. "You've always been dramatic about these things, sweetheart. Ever since you were little, you've blown situations out of proportion. Vanessa was just trying to teach him some boundaries. Sometimes children need firm guidance." The phrase hit me like cold water. "You've always been dramatic." How many times had I heard those words growing up? How many times had my legitimate concerns been dismissed without exact explanation? I found myself gripping the phone tighter than necessary. "He's 6 months old, Mom. He doesn't understand boundaries. He understands that someone hurt him for expressing a basic need." "Now you sound like David," Mom said, and there was something in her tone that made me pause. "He's always been very rigid about rules and procedures. Military men often are, but families work differently than the army, Natalie. Families require flexibility and forgiveness." David looked up from Lucas's bottle, one eyebrow raised. He'd obviously heard enough of the conversation to catch his name being mentioned. I could see him making mental notes, the way he did when gathering intelligence about a situation that might require a strategic plan. "What does David have to do with this?" I asked. "Well, he's the one who made the big scene. Vanessa said he was completely unreasonable, ordering people around like he was commanding troops. She said he threatened to ban her from the family." Mom's voice trailed off, as if she couldn't find words for how inappropriate she found David's behavior. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Mom, David protected our son from someone who had just hit him. That's what fathers do. That's what anyone should do when they see a child being hurt. But Vanessa is family, honey. Family means giving people second chances. It means not letting one mistake destroy relationships that have been built over decades. David doesn't understand that because he didn't grow up with us. He doesn't know how we handle things." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, each exchange making me feel more disoriented. Mom painted a picture of events that bore little resemblance to what I'd witnessed. In her version, Vanessa had barely made contact with Lucas, everyone had overreacted, and David had turned a minor family disagreement into a major crisis through his inflexibility and outsider's perspective on family dynamics. When I finally hung up, David was watching me with the expression he wore when debriefing after a difficult mission. "Let me guess," he said. "It's our fault." "According to my mother, yes. Vanessa feels terrible, but I'm being dramatic and you're being controlling because you don't understand how families work." I slumped against the kitchen counter, feeling exhausted despite having been awake for less than 2 hours. "She actually said that you don't understand family dynamics because you didn't grow up with them." "She's right about that," David said quietly. "I didn't grow up with them. I grew up in a family where adults protected children instead of making excuses for people who hurt them." The difference hit me with unexpected force. David's family had its own challenges, but I'd never heard his parents dismiss abuse or ask victims to be more understanding of their attacker. When his grandmother, Eleanor, had been alive, she'd been fiercely protective of all her grandchildren, never tolerating anyone who tried to harm them physically or emotionally. The phone rang again an hour later. This time, it was Dad, speaking in the careful tone he used when trying to mediate family conflicts. He'd clearly been coached on what to say, probably by Mom, because his words had a rehearsed quality that didn't match his usual scattered communication style. "Natalie, I think we all need to take a step back and look at this situation more objectively. Your mother told me about her conversation with you this morning, and it sounds like there might be some miscommunication about what actually happened yesterday." "Dad, there's no miscommunication. Vanessa hit Lucas." Multiple people saw it happen. There's nothing unclear about the situation. Well, that's just it. Vanessa said she was just trying to get his attention, maybe redirect his fussing. She said she might have been a little firmer than necessary, but she never intended to hurt him. And honestly, looking at him now, he seems fine. Children are resilient. I found myself staring at the ceiling, trying to process the cognitive dissonance of having my own father explain to me what had happened to my own child. Dad, intent doesn't matter when we're talking about hitting a baby. The impact matters. The fact that she thought striking him was an appropriate response to crying matters. But that's the thing, sweetheart. She's not experienced with babies. She was just trying to help in the moment. Sometimes people make poor choices when they're trying to handle unfamiliar situations. The conversation followed the same pattern as the one with Mom. Every concern I raised was met with an explanation for why it wasn't really a problem. Every time I tried to center Lucas's well-being, the discussion was redirected to Vanessa's feelings, her inexperience, her stress levels, her good intentions. By the time Dad hung up, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Had I misunderstood what happened? Was I overreacting to something that was genuinely minor? The voices of my parents, people I'd trusted my entire life, were telling me that my perceptions were wrong, that my protective instincts were misguided, that my husband's response had been disproportionate. David found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at my phone with an expression he later told me looked like shell shock. He'd finished settling Lucas for his morning nap and came to check on me, immediately recognizing that something had shifted during the second conversation. "What did your dad say?" he asked, sitting down across from me. He said that Vanessa didn't mean to hurt Lucas, that she was just trying to help, that maybe she was a little firmer than necessary, but children are resilient. I repeated the words in a flat tone, as if saying them might help me make sense of them. David was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Then he asked, "What do you think happened yesterday?" The question surprised me, not because I didn't know the answer, but because no one else had asked me what I thought. Everyone had been telling me what to think, explaining what had really happened, correcting my understanding of events I'd witnessed with my own eyes. I think my sister hit my baby because he was crying and it was interfering with her filming. I think it was hard enough to leave a mark and shock him into silence. I think it was completely inappropriate and potentially harmful. I paused, feeling some clarity return as I spoke my own truth out loud. And I think my parents are more interested in protecting Vanessa from consequences than they are in protecting Lucas from being hurt again. That's what I think too, David said. So the question is, do you trust your own perceptions, or do you trust people who are telling you that what you saw didn't really happen? It was a fair question, but also a devastating one. The people asking me to doubt my own perceptions were my parents. People who had shaped my understanding of right and wrong for my entire life. The person supporting my perceptions was my husband, someone I'd known for 5 years, but who had consistently demonstrated better judgment and clearer moral boundaries than my family of origin. The third phone call came that afternoon, and this time it was Vanessa herself. Her voice was thick with tears, trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. This was the sister I remembered from childhood, vulnerable and seeking connection, rather than the polished influencer persona she'd developed over the years. "Naughty, I feel so horrible about what happened. I haven't been able to eat or sleep since yesterday. I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering how I could have handled things differently." For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be the conversation where she acknowledged what had happened and took responsibility for her actions. Maybe we could find a way forward that didn't require cutting her out of our lives entirely. "I'm glad you called, Vanessa. Lucas is okay, but I was really shocked by what happened. I need to understand why you thought hitting him was an appropriate response to his crying." "That's just it," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I don't think I really hit him. I think I just touched his cheek to get his attention. And maybe because everyone was so tense about the filming, it seemed like more than it was. You know how these things can get blown out of proportion when emotions are running high. The hope I'd felt moments earlier evaporated instantly." She wasn't calling to apologize or take responsibility. She was calling to continue the family narrative that what I'd witnessed hadn't really happened. "Vanessa, there was a sound when your hand made contact with his face. There was a mark on his cheek." He went from crying to completely silent in shock before he started wailing. That's not a gentle touch to get someone's attention. But that's what I'm trying to tell you. I think everyone's perception was distorted by the stress of the situation, the cameras, the disrupted filming, David's reaction. It all created this atmosphere where a normal interaction got interpreted as something much more serious. I found myself gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "Are you saying I imagined the mark on my baby's face?" "I'm saying that maybe what looked like a mark was just the natural redness that comes from crying. Maybe what sounded like a slap was just the sound of contact that seemed louder because the room was so quiet. Maybe what felt like a big deal in the moment isn't actually as serious as it seemed." The conversation continued in this vein for 20 more minutes. Vanessa had crafted an alternative narrative where her actions had been completely reasonable and everyone else's reactions had been excessive. She'd convinced herself that she was the victim of our misunderstanding, possibly even a conspiracy to make her look bad. When I finally ended the call, I felt like I'd been wrestling with smoke. Every time I tried to pin down what had actually happened, she redirected the conversation to interpretations, perceptions, and alternative explanations that made my own memories feel unreliable. David found me in Lucas's nursery, standing over his crib and watching him sleep. He was lying on his back, one tiny fist curled near his face, completely peaceful and trusting. The sight of him, so small and defenseless, crystallized something inside me that had been building all day. "She's gaslighting me," I said without turning around. "All of them are. They're trying to make me believe that what I saw didn't really happen." "Yes," David said quietly. "They are. Why would they do that? Why would my own family try to make me doubt my own perceptions about something this serious?" David joined me at the crib, both of us watching our son sleep. Because acknowledging what really happened would require them to take action they're not willing to take. It would mean holding Vanessa accountable, which might disrupt their family dynamic. It would mean admitting they failed to protect Lucas, which would force them to examine their own behavior. So instead, they make you the problem. The fourth call of the day came that evening, just as David and I were settling in to watch a movie after putting Lucas to bed. This time, it was Mom again, but her tone had shifted from pleading to frustrated. The careful diplomacy of the morning conversation had been replaced by something sharper. "Natalie, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I'm concerned about how you're handling this situation. You're being very rigid and unforgiving, which isn't like you. I'm wondering if maybe the stress of new motherhood is affecting your judgment." I felt David tense beside me on the couch. The suggestion that my judgment was compromised by postpartum issues was a particularly low blow, and we both recognized it as such. "Mom, my judgment is fine. My priorities are clear. Protecting my child from people who think it's acceptable to hit him isn't negotiable." "But that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're characterizing this as hitting when it was clearly something much less serious. You're creating conflict where none needs to exist. You're making choices that are going to damage family relationships permanently over something that could be resolved with basic communication and forgiveness. What would resolution look like to you?" I asked, genuinely curious about what she thought an acceptable outcome would be. "Vanessa apologizes for the misunderstanding. You accept that she didn't mean any harm. David acknowledges that his reaction was excessive, and we all move forward with better communication and more patience for each other's differences." I let that sink in for a moment. In Mom's vision of resolution, everyone bore equal responsibility for what had happened. Vanessa would offer a non-apology for a misunderstanding rather than accountability for her actions. I would accept blame for misinterpreting the situation. David would admit to overreacting to what he'd witnessed. And Lucas, the actual victim, would be completely absent from the conversation about making things right. "What about Lucas?" I asked. "What does resolution look like for him?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what protections would be put in place to ensure this doesn't happen again? What boundaries would be established to keep him safe at future family gatherings? What accountability measures would ensure that Vanessa has processed why hitting a baby is never acceptable?" Mom was quiet for a moment. Then, irritably, "Natalie, you're overthinking this. He's fine. He's not going to remember any of this. You're creating trauma where none exists." And there it was, the heart of our fundamental disagreement. In my family's worldview, trauma only existed if the victim remembered it clearly and could articulate its impact. A baby who couldn't form lasting memories of being struck couldn't be truly harmed by the experience. Adult comfort and family harmony took precedence over protecting children from experiences they might not remember. After I hung up, David and I sat in silence for several minutes. The movie we'd planned to watch remained paused on the opening screen while we both processed what was becoming clear. This wasn't going to blow over. My family wasn't going to come around to understanding why their response was inadequate, and we were going to have to make decisions about how to move forward with people who fundamentally disagreed with our basic values about protecting children. "I feel like I'm going crazy," I admitted finally. 3 different people have told me that what I saw didn't really happen. People I've trusted my entire life are asking me to doubt my own perceptions about something this basic. "That's the point," David said. "They need you to doubt yourself because if you trust what you saw, you'll make choices they don't want you to make. If you believe Lucas was actually hurt, you'll protect him from people who might hurt him again. They can't have that." "But why? Why is protecting Vanessa from consequences more important than protecting Lucas from being hurt?" David was quiet for a long time, and I could see him working through something complex. Finally, he said, "I think your family has spent a long time organizing itself around managing Vanessa's needs and emotions. She's the center of attention, the source of drama, the person everyone has to accommodate. Protecting that system is more important than protecting individual members who threaten it." The observation hit me with uncomfortable accuracy. Growing up, family decisions had often been made based on how they would affect Vanessa's mood, her plans, her comfort level. Family gatherings were scheduled around her availability. Conversations were moderated to avoid topics that might upset her. Even my own achievements had been downplayed if they threatened to overshadow her latest project or accomplishment. I'd accepted this dynamic as normal, even healthy. Families supported their most sensitive members, made accommodations for people who needed extra attention, prioritized harmony over individual preference. It had never occurred to me that this support system could become so entrenched that it would prioritize Vanessa's comfort over a baby's safety. The final call of the day came close to midnight. I was already in bed, but still awake, replaying the conversations and trying to make sense of the position my family was asking me to take. When I saw Vanessa's name on the caller ID, I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Maybe curiosity about whether her approach would be different in this late-night conversation. Natalie, I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about how to fix this mess. Her voice was softer than it had been earlier, less defensive and more sad. I miss you. I miss being close to you like we were when we were kids. For a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the relationship we'd had before life became complicated. There had been years when Vanessa and I were genuinely close, when her creativity and energy had felt inspiring rather than overwhelming. When her attention had felt like a gift rather than a performance. I miss that too, I said honestly. But I need you to understand why yesterday was so serious. Lucas is my baby, and seeing someone hurt him triggered every protective instinct I have. I get that. I really do. And I would never intentionally hurt him. You have to know that about me. Maybe I was too focused on the filming. Maybe I wasn't thinking clearly, but I would never deliberately harm a child. It felt like progress. This acknowledgement that her judgment had been compromised and that her actions had been inappropriate. For the first time all day, I felt like we might be able to find common ground. Thank you for saying that. I know you wouldn't hurt him on purpose, but impact matters as much as intent. And the impact was that he got hurt. What I need is some assurance that you understand why it happened and how to prevent it from happening again. Of course. I think what I need to do is be more mindful when I'm around children, especially when I'm stressed or working. Maybe I should ask for help instead of trying to handle situations on my own. It wasn't a complete acknowledgement of what had happened, but it felt like movement in the right direction. We talked for another few minutes about boundaries and communication, about the challenges of balancing family time with work responsibilities, about the adjustments we'd all need to make as Lucas grew up. When we hung up, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since Christmas dinner. Maybe this could be worked out. Maybe we could establish clear boundaries and rebuild trust gradually. Maybe the relationships didn't have to be permanently damaged by one terrible moment. But the next morning brought a text message that shattered any hope I'd had for reconciliation. It was from Chloe Martinez, our neighbor at Fort Henderson, who had become a close friend over the past year. The message was brief but devastating. Saw Vanessa's Instagram story. Are you okay? I opened Instagram with shaking hands, navigating to Vanessa's account. The story was titled Family Drama and Moving Forward, and it was a carefully crafted narrative about the challenges of blending families with different parenting styles. She talked about the difficulties of holiday gatherings, the stress of documenting family moments, and the importance of forgiveness and grace when misunderstandings occur. According to her version of events, there had been a minor disagreement about appropriate behavior at dinner, escalated by miscommunication and different expectations. She painted herself as someone trying to help with a fussy baby who had been misunderstood by overprotective parents unfamiliar with extended family dynamics. She never mentioned hitting Lucas, never acknowledged that any harm had been done, and characterized the entire conflict as a learning experience about family communication. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. Her followers praised her maturity, her grace under pressure, her commitment to family relationships despite difficult circumstances. Several people shared their own stories about in-law conflicts and parenting disagreements, offering advice about setting boundaries and managing different parenting philosophies. I screenshotted the entire story before it could disappear, then sat staring at my phone in disbelief. Less than 12 hours after what had felt like a breakthrough conversation about accountability and prevention, Vanessa had publicly reframed the entire incident as a misunderstanding caused by my overreaction and David's inflexibility. She had taken the private conversation we'd had about her poor judgment and stress levels and transformed it into a public narrative about other people's unreasonable expectations. She had positioned herself as the victim of family drama rather than the adult who had struck a baby. And she had done it all while maintaining plausible deniability, never technically lying while also never telling the truth. When David came home from his morning run and found me crying at the kitchen table, I showed him the phone without saying anything. He read through the Instagram story twice, his expression growing grim with each sentence. She played you, he said finally. The late-night call, the apparent acknowledgement of responsibility, the promise to be more mindful, all of it was designed to get information she could use to craft this narrative. I felt foolish for having believed that the conversation represented genuine remorse or growth. But more than that, I felt betrayed by someone I'd loved and trusted since childhood, someone who had used my willingness to give her another chance as an opportunity to further manipulate the situation. The phone started ringing again, but this time I didn't answer. I could see it was Mom, probably calling to discuss Vanessa's Instagram story and encourage me to see it as a positive step toward resolution. But I was done listening to explanations about why my perceptions were wrong and my boundaries were unreasonable. Instead, I did something I'd never done before in a family conflict. I started documenting everything. I wrote down exactly what had happened at Christmas dinner, including direct quotes from everyone involved. I saved screenshots of Vanessa's Instagram story and the supportive comments from her followers. I made notes about each phone conversation, including the specific language my family members had used to minimize the incident and question my judgment. For the first time in my life, I was treating my family like potential adversaries rather than trusted allies. And as I organized the evidence of their gaslighting and manipulation, I began to understand that this pattern had been happening for much longer than just the past few days. This was how they had always handled conflicts that threatened their preferred narrative. This was how they had always managed situations where Vanessa's behavior created problems for other people. This was how they had trained me over decades to doubt my own perceptions and prioritize family harmony over my own well-being. But this time was different. This time the victim wasn't just me. It was my infant son. Someone who couldn't advocate for himself or choose to walk away from a harmful situation. This time I had a partner who supported my perceptions and validated my concerns rather than asking me to be more understanding of people who had hurt us. And this time I was going to fight back. The documentation process revealed patterns I hadn't consciously recognized before. As I scrolled through old text messages and social media posts, a clear picture emerged of how my family had been managing conflicts for years. Every time Vanessa created a problem, the same cycle played out: initial shock, followed by explanations and excuses, then pressure on everyone else to accommodate her version of events. I found a text thread from 2 years earlier when Vanessa had shown up 4 hours late to our grandmother Eleanor's memorial service because she'd been filming a collaboration with a makeup brand. Instead of addressing her disrespect, the family had spent the entire reception discussing how grief affects people differently and how we all cope with loss in our own way. My hurt feelings about her absence during the most important parts of the service had been reframed as selfishness during a difficult time. Another thread from last spring revealed a similar pattern when Vanessa had borrowed Mom's car and returned it with significant damage from what she called a minor parking lot incident. The insurance claim showed thousands of dollars in repairs, but the family conversation focused on how accidents happen and how material possessions weren't worth damaging relationships. Mom had ended up paying the deductible herself rather than asking Vanessa to take responsibility. The more I looked, the clearer it became that I had been trained to accept this dynamic as normal family behavior. I'd learned to minimize my own needs, question my own perceptions, and prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own well-being. The Christmas dinner incident wasn't an anomaly. It was the most extreme example of a pattern that had been shaping my life for decades. David found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed screenshots and handwritten notes, creating what looked like a case file for a criminal investigation. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from me, studying the organized evidence I'd spread across the surface. "This looks like intelligence gathering," he observed. "That's exactly what it is. I'm trying to understand how they do this, how they consistently manage to make me feel like I'm the problem when they're the ones causing harm." I gestured to a timeline I'd created of family conflicts over the past 5 years. "Look at this pattern. Every single time, the same thing happened." David examined the timeline, noting the recurring elements: incident, denial, reframing, pressure to forgive, eventual acceptance of the family narrative. "It's sophisticated. They've created a system that protects Vanessa from consequences while training everyone else to doubt their own judgment." But why me specifically? Why am I always the one being asked to be more understanding, more forgiving, more flexible? Because you're the one who challenges. You're the one who notices when things don't add up. You're the one who asks uncomfortable questions. He pointed to several incidents on my timeline. "Look at these. In every case, you were the person who initially called out the problematic behavior. They need to neutralize you because you're the threat to their system." The observation hit me with uncomfortable accuracy. I had always been the family member who pointed out inconsistencies, who asked why certain behaviors were acceptable, who pushed for accountability when things went wrong. I thought of myself as helpful, as someone who wanted to improve family dynamics by addressing problems directly. But from the family's perspective, I was a disruptor who threatened their carefully maintained equilibrium. My phone buzzed with another text from Mom. "Honey, I saw that you read Vanessa's Instagram story. I hope you can see that she's really trying to move forward in a positive way. Maybe we could all get together this weekend to talk through everything calmly." I showed the message to David, who shook his head. "They're trying to reset the narrative again, get everyone in the same room, apply social pressure, and convince you to accept their version of events for the sake of family peace." "But what if I'm wrong?" I asked, a flicker of doubt still lingering. "What if I am being too rigid, too unforgiving? What if there really is a way to work through this that doesn't require cutting people out of our lives?" David set down his coffee cup and looked at me seriously. "Let me ask you something. If one of my soldiers struck a baby during a family gathering and then spent the next week convincing everyone that it hadn't really happened while publicly reframing themselves as the victim, what would you think I should do?" The question clarified everything instantly. If this were happening to anyone else's family, if I were watching from the outside, I would be horrified by the gaslighting and manipulation. I would advise them to protect their child and maintain clear boundaries with people who refuse to acknowledge harmful behavior. I would tell them to document everything and stay away from people who think hitting babies is negotiable. "Right," I answered. "So why is your family different?" I didn't have a good answer for that question. The only reason I was considering compromise was because these were people I'd loved my entire life. People whose approval I'd sought since childhood. People whose rejection felt like losing a fundamental part of my identity. But none of those reasons justified exposing Lucas to people who might hurt him again. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Chloe Martinez. She'd been following the situation since sending me the text about Vanessa's Instagram story, and she had information that changed everything. "Natalie, I need to tell you something, but I'm not sure how you're going to take it. I've been going through Vanessa's social media more carefully, and I found some posts from earlier this year that I think you need to see." She sent me screenshots of several posts from Vanessa's account dating back to when Lucas was first born. One showed a professional photo shoot she'd done using baby props and accessories, captioned with something about the beauty of new beginnings and the joy of expanding family. Another featured her holding what appeared to be a newborn with text about the blessings of being an aunt and the special bond between sisters. The problem was the timing. Both posts had been published weeks before Lucas was actually born, using stock photos and borrowed babies to create content about an experience she hadn't had yet. She'd been monetizing her relationship with my unborn child, creating sponsored content about our family moments before they'd even happened. There's more, Chloe said when I called her back after reviewing the screenshots. I found a whole series of posts about family, traditions, holiday celebrations, and multi-generational gatherings that all feature photos from Christmas dinner last year. The one you and David missed because of his deployment. She's been creating this narrative about close family relationships that doesn't actually exist. I felt sick looking at the evidence. Vanessa had built a brand around family content that portrayed relationships and experiences that were largely fiction. Her followers believed she was documenting authentic family moments, but she was actually crafting carefully staged content designed to generate engagement and sponsorship opportunities. The Christmas dinner incident started making more sense in this context. Vanessa hadn't just been filming for personal documentation. She'd been creating content for a business that depended on maintaining a specific image of family harmony and celebration. Lucas's crying had threatened not just her filming schedule, but her entire brand identity as someone who effortlessly managed beautiful family moments. When David came home that evening, I showed him everything Chloe had discovered. He studied the evidence with the methodical attention he gave to intelligence briefings, noting dates, inconsistencies, and patterns that revealed the scope of Vanessa's deception. She's been using her family as content for months, he said, and not just documenting real experiences. She's been creating fictional narratives about relationships that exist primarily for her audience, which means the Christmas dinner wasn't about family time at all. It was about creating content that would support her brand. Lucas and I were just props in her production. And when Lucas interfered with the production by acting like a normal baby, she prioritized her content over his well-being. The realization was devastating, but also clarifying. This hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment by someone who cared about us, but was overwhelmed by stress. This had been a calculated decision by someone who viewed our family as raw material for her business and who was willing to harm a child to protect her commercial interests. I spent the evening going through more of Vanessa's content, documenting the extent to which she'd been monetizing our family relationships without our knowledge or consent. She'd used photos of our wedding, stories about David's deployment, and speculation about our future children to create sponsored posts about military families, long-distance relationships, and the importance of family support systems. Most disturbing were the posts about grandparents and family traditions, which portrayed mom and dad as deeply involved, loving grandparents, despite the fact that they'd shown minimal interest in actually developing relationships with Lucas. The gap between Vanessa's public narrative and our private reality was enormous. But her followers had no way of knowing that the family closeness she documented was largely performative. The next morning brought a series of texts from various family members, all encouraging me to attend a family meeting mom had scheduled for the weekend. The messages used remarkably similar language about healing, communication, and moving forward together, suggesting they'd been coordinated in advance. But I was done being managed. Instead of responding to the texts, I called my family's insurance company to report the incident involving Lucas. I wasn't planning to file a claim, but I wanted the incident documented in case it became relevant later. The representative was professional but clearly disturbed by what I was reporting, asking multiple times if I needed resources for child protection services. I also called our pediatrician's office to schedule a consultation about the incident. Dr. Rebecca Walsh had been treating Lucas since birth, and I trusted her judgment about whether he needed any additional monitoring or care. When I explained what had happened, she immediately scheduled an appointment and asked me to bring photos of any marks or bruises. The pediatric appointment was both validating and heartbreaking. Dr. Walsh examined Lucas carefully, documented the fading mark on his cheek, and asked detailed questions about the circumstances of the incident. Her concern was serious, regardless of intent or family relationship. Parents need to trust their protective instincts, she told me as she completed her documentation. When something feels wrong, it usually is wrong. Your job is to keep Lucas safe, not to manage other people's feelings about your safety measures. She also provided me with resources about family violence and information about documenting incidents for potential legal proceedings. I hadn't considered legal action, but having the information felt empowering after days of being told my concerns were overblown. That afternoon, I received a call from Captain Ryan Torres, one of David's closest colleagues at Fort Henderson. He and his wife Maria had become good friends of ours over the past year, and they'd been following the situation with concern. Natalie, I hope you don't mind me calling, but Maria and I wanted you to know that we're behind you 100%. What happened to Lucas is unacceptable, and the way your family is handling it is concerning. I felt a wave of relief hearing validation from someone outside the situation. After days of being told I was overreacting, it was powerful to hear from other parents who found the incident as disturbing as I did. Thank you, Ryan. I've been starting to doubt my own judgment about everything. Don't. You're a good mother, and you're doing exactly what you should be doing. David is lucky to have a partner who will stand up for their child, even when it's difficult. Ryan also shared something that David had mentioned to him but hadn't told me yet. David had been consulting with military legal services about potential options for protecting our family from further incident. The military took family violence seriously, and there were resources available for service members dealing with civilian family conflicts that might affect their security clearance or job performance. The conversation helped me realize that David and I weren't alone in this situation. We had a community of people who shared our values about protecting children and maintaining clear boundaries with people who caused harm. Our family of choice was standing behind us, even if our family of origin was not. That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I drafted a group text to Mom, Dad, and Vanessa, clearly stating our boundaries going forward. The message was calm but firm, explaining that we would not be attending family gatherings until Vanessa acknowledged what had happened and demonstrated genuine accountability for her actions. The response was immediate and intense. My phone began buzzing with calls and messages within minutes of sending the text. Mom called first, her voice high with panic, begging me not to destroy the family over a misunderstanding. Dad texted asking me to reconsider, such a drastic response to what he called a minor incident. Vanessa sent a series of messages alternating between anger and hurt, accusing me of being vindictive and manipulative. But the message that stopped me cold came from Linda, my aunt, Mom's sister. She was usually quiet and avoided family conflict. Her text was brief, but devastating. Saw the Instagram situation. This isn't the first time. Call me when you're ready to hear about the others. I stared at the message for several minutes before showing it to David. What others? He asked. I have no idea, but Linda wouldn't say something like that unless she had specific information. I called Linda immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. Natalie, honey, I've been watching the situation unfold, and I think it's time you knew some things about your family that they've been keeping from you. There have been other incidents over the years. Times when Vanessa hurt people. Usually children. And the family covered it up or explained it away. I never said anything because it wasn't my place. But watching them do it to your baby? I can't stay quiet anymore. The conversation that followed lasted for 2 hours and changed everything I thought I knew about my family history. Linda told me about incidents dating back to when Vanessa was a teenager, times when she'd been rough with younger cousins, harsh with children she was babysitting, inappropriate with kids at family gatherings. In every case, the family had intervened to minimize the situation and protect Vanessa from consequences. Parents were told their children were being dramatic or oversensitive. Witnesses were asked to keep quiet for the sake of family harmony. Vanessa was coached on what to say to avoid trouble, but never actually held accountable for her behavior. I've watched your parents train that girl to believe she can hurt people without consequences, and I've watched them train everyone else to accept it, Natalie, Linda said. When I saw what happened at Christmas dinner, and then saw how they were handling it, I knew it was time to speak up. Linda also revealed something that explained a lot about the family dynamic. Vanessa had been born with some developmental delays that had required extensive early intervention and special education services. Mom and Dad had spent years advocating for her, fighting for accommodations, and protecting her from situations where she might struggle or fail. The problem was that they'd never transitioned from protecting a child with special needs to holding an adult accountable for harmful behavior. They'd continued making excuses and providing accommodations long past the point where Vanessa was capable of understanding and controlling her actions. She knows exactly what she's doing, Linda said. She's learned that if she can make people feel sorry for her, or if she can convince them that she's just misunderstood, she can get away with almost anything. And your parents enable it because they've spent so many years seeing her as vulnerable that they can't recognize when she's being manipulative. By the time I hung up with Linda, I felt like I'd been given a completely different map of my family territory. Suddenly, decades of confusing interactions made sense. The pattern of protecting Vanessa at everyone else's expense wasn't just a recent development. It was a system that had been refined over years. More importantly, Linda's information made it clear that Lucas wasn't Vanessa's first victim, and he wouldn't be her last if the family continued enabling her behavior. The Christmas dinner incident wasn't an isolated mistake. It was the latest example of a long-standing pattern that had been hidden from me because I'd been too young, too distant, or too willing to accept family explanations. The next morning, I woke up with absolute clarity about what needed to happen. I wasn't just protecting Lucas from one bad incident. I was breaking a generational cycle of abuse and enabling that had been damaging children in my family for years. I called Linda back and asked her if she would be willing to document what she'd told me, to provide written statements about the incidents she'd witnessed. She agreed immediately, saying she'd been carrying the guilt of staying silent for too long. I also reached out to other family members who might have information, people who'd been present during some of the incidents Linda had described. Some were reluctant to get involved, but others were relieved to finally talk about things they'd witnessed and been asked to forget. By the end of the week, I had a comprehensive picture of how my family had been protecting Vanessa from consequences while putting other people's children at risk. I had written statements from multiple witnesses, documentation of previous incidents, and clear evidence that the Christmas dinner event was part of a much larger pattern. David and I spent that weekend planning our next steps. We weren't interested in revenge or public humiliation, but we were committed to protecting Lucas and potentially preventing future incidents with other children. We decided to share our documentation with family members who had children, to give them the information they needed to make informed decisions about their own safety. We also made the decision to maintain our boundaries regardless of how the family responded. Linda's information had made it clear that this wasn't a problem that could be solved with better communication or more understanding. This was a problem that required fundamental changes in accountability and consequences. Changes that my family had shown no willingness to make. Most importantly, we decided to build our own family traditions and support systems that didn't depend on people who prioritize maintaining dysfunction over protecting children. Lucas deserved to grow up in an environment where his safety was never negotiable, where adults took responsibility for their actions, and where his well-being wasn't sacrificed for someone else's comfort. As I organized the evidence we gathered and prepared to share it with relevant family members, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of having complete information and the power to act on it. I was no longer the confused family member being told that my perceptions were wrong. I was someone who understood exactly what was happening and why, and who had the resources to respond appropriately. The war that had begun with a slapped baby was about to become a battle for the truth. And for the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt confident about which side would win. The breaking point came when I received a certified letter from Vanessa's attorney demanding I cease what they called a defamation campaign against their client. The letter claimed I was spreading false information about the Christmas dinner events and damaging Vanessa's professional reputation through malicious statements to family members and online activity. I stared at the legal letterhead in disbelief. I hadn't posted anything online about the incident. Hadn't spoken to anyone outside the immediate family except for close friends who'd asked direct questions. The only campaign I'd conducted was documenting actual events and sharing factual information with relatives who had young children. David read the letter over my shoulder, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. "They're trying to intimidate you into silence," he said. "This is what people do when they know they're guilty, but can't afford to have the truth come out." The letter demanded I sign a statement acknowledging that no assault had occurred, that any claims about Vanessa striking Lucas were fabricated, and that I would refrain from making any future statements that could damage her business interests. In exchange, they would not pursue legal action for defamation and intentional interference with business relationships. Business relationships, I repeated, feeling the full weight of what this revealed. She's not worried about family harmony or healing relationships. She's worried about her brand and her income stream. That afternoon, I called the law office of Janet Morrison, an attorney Linda had recommended who specialized in family law and child protection cases. Janet agreed to see me immediately after I explained the situation, and her initial assessment was both reassuring and concerning. "The letter is largely bluster," she told me after reviewing the documentation I'd assembled. "Truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims, and you have substantial evidence supporting your version of events. But the fact that they're escalating to legal threats suggests they're feeling genuine pressure about something." Janet helped me understand that Vanessa's business model depended heavily on maintaining a specific public image. If sponsors and followers learned about her history with children, or if her family relationships were revealed to be largely fictional, the financial impact could be devastating. The legal threats weren't really about protecting her reputation. They were about protecting her income. "I want you to prepare for them to escalate further," Janet warned. "People with a lot to lose can become dangerous when they feel cornered. Document everything, stay safe, and don't engage directly with any of them until we develop a comprehensive strategy." The strategy session with Janet revealed options I hadn't considered. We could file for a restraining order based on the threats and harassment. We could pursue our own legal action for intentional infliction of emotional distress. We could report the incident to Child Protective Services to create an official record that might protect other children in the future. Most importantly, Janet helped me understand that I wasn't required to keep family secrets that put children at risk. The evidence I'd gathered about previous incidents wasn't gossip or betrayal. It was information that other parents had a right to know when making decisions about their children's safety. That evening, I made copies of everything we'd assembled and prepared packages for family members with young children. Each package included documentation of the Christmas dinner incident, witness statements about previous events, and information about Vanessa's pattern of avoiding accountability. I wasn't asking anyone to choose sides or cut contact. I was simply providing information they could use to make informed decisions. The response was swift and explosive. Within hours of delivering the packages, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from family members I hadn't spoken to in months. Some were supportive, thanking me for information that explained incidents they'd witnessed but been told to forget. Others were furious, accusing me of trying to destroy the family and create drama where none had existed. Mom called in hysterics, demanding I explain why I was attacking Vanessa with lies and propaganda. She'd apparently seen some of the documentation and was devastated by what Linda and others had shared about incidents she thought had been successfully minimized. "Those things happened years ago," she sobbed into the phone. "Vanessa was just a child herself in some of those situations. She didn't understand what she was doing. Why are you dragging up ancient history to hurt her now?" "Because it's not ancient history, Mom. It's a pattern that's continuing today, and because other parents deserve to know about that pattern when they're making decisions about their children's safety." But she's changed. She's grown up. She would never intentionally hurt a child now. She hit Lucas 6 days ago, Mom. Whatever changes you think she's made clearly haven't addressed the fundamental problem. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Mom alternating between begging me to retract the information and threatening to cut me out of the family entirely if I destroyed Vanessa's life. It was the same emotional manipulation I'd experienced my entire life. But this time, I recognized it for what it was and refused to be swayed by it. Dad's response was different, but equally revealing. He called late that night, speaking in the controlled tone he used when trying to manage family crises. His approach was more strategic than Mom's emotional appeals, focusing on practical concerns about reputation and consequences. Natalie, I understand you're upset about what happened, but this approach is going to hurt everyone, including you and David. If this information becomes public, it could affect David's military career. Have you thought about the security clearance implications of being involved in a family scandal? It was a low blow, trying to use David's professional obligations to pressure me into silence. But it also revealed how little Dad understood about military values. The military didn't penalize service members for protecting children or reporting abuse. Quite the opposite. Dad, David's career is built on integrity and protecting people who can't protect themselves. His command structure would be more concerned if he failed to protect his own child from someone with a history of violence. But Vanessa doesn't have a history of violence. These are isolated incidents that happened years apart, mostly when she was young herself. You're creating a narrative that makes her sound like a dangerous predator when she's just someone who's made some mistakes. Mistakes are accidents, Dad. Patterns are choices. And a pattern of hurting children, followed by a pattern of avoiding consequences, isn't something I'm going to help hide anymore. The most devastating call came from my cousin Sarah, who had been present during several of the incidents Linda had described. Sarah was now a mother of 2 young children, and she'd received one of my information packages with deep concern. Natalie, I need you to know that I believe everything you've documented. I was there for some of those incidents, and I've been carrying guilt about staying quiet for years. Her voice was shaky but determined. When I saw what happened to Lucas and then saw how everyone was handling it, I realized I couldn't protect my own kids if I couldn't even acknowledge what I'd witnessed. Sarah shared details about an incident from her teenage years that hadn't made it into Linda's account. During a family reunion, Vanessa had pushed Sarah's younger brother down a flight of stairs after he'd accidentally knocked over something she was filming. The boy had suffered a concussion and several bruises, but the family had explained it as an accident and forbidden Sarah from talking about what she'd actually seen. I was 17 and scared of causing family drama, so I went along with the story, but I've regretted it ever since. And when I had my own children, I made sure they were never alone with Vanessa, even though I couldn't explain why to other family members. Sarah's testimony was particularly powerful because she'd been old enough to understand the situation clearly and had maintained consistent memories of events over more than a decade. Her willingness to finally speak publicly about what she'd witnessed provided crucial corroboration for the pattern we'd identified. But Sarah also revealed something that changed my understanding of the current situation. Natalie, there's something else you need to know. Vanessa isn't just worried about her current business. She's been in talks with a major network about a reality show centered around her family content. The Christmas dinner footage was supposed to be part of her audition reel. The information hit me like a physical blow. Vanessa hadn't just been creating content for her existing followers. She'd been filming us for a potential television show without our knowledge or consent. Lucas's first Christmas had been treated as raw material for entertainment production, and when he'd interfered with that production by acting like a normal baby, she'd prioritized the footage over his well-being. The network executives are supposed to review her submission this week, Sarah continued. That's probably why she's escalating the legal threats. If this information becomes public before they make their decision, it could destroy the biggest opportunity she's ever had. I shared this information with David when he returned from base that evening. His reaction was immediate and intense, not anger, but the cold fury of someone who'd realized the full scope of a threat he'd underestimated. She exploited our family for commercial purposes without our consent. And when our infant son interfered with her production, she assaulted him, he said, his voice deadly calm. And now she's threatening legal action to prevent us from protecting other children from similar treatment. David's military training had taught him to identify and neutralize threats systematically. He approached this situation with the same methodical precision he brought to tactical planning, identifying objectives, assessing resources, and developing strategies to protect what mattered most. We're not just dealing with a family conflict anymore, he told me. We're dealing with someone who's willing to harm children for financial gain and use legal intimidation to cover it up. That makes her a legitimate threat that needs to be addressed through appropriate channels. The next morning, David contacted his command to report the situation and request guidance about potential security clearance implications. The response was immediate and supportive. His commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, made it clear that the military expected service members to report child abuse and protect their families from ongoing threats. The service takes these situations very seriously, Colonel Martinez told us during a meeting at his office. We can't have personnel being blackmailed or intimidated by family members, especially when child safety is involved. We'll provide whatever support you need to resolve this appropriately. The military's backing was both practical and psychological. It meant David wouldn't face professional consequences for standing up to family pressure, and it gave us access to military legal resources if the situation escalated further. More importantly, it validated our decision to prioritize child protection over family harmony. That afternoon, Janet Morrison called with an update about Vanessa's legal threats. After reviewing our documentation and witness statements, she drafted a response that turned the tables completely. Instead of defending against defamation claims, we were putting Vanessa on notice about potential legal action for assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and using our family for commercial purposes without consent. The beauty of truth as a defense, Janet explained, is that it forces the other side to prove their claims are false. Given the evidence you've assembled, that's going to be very difficult for them to do. More likely, they'll realize that pursuing this legally will only create more public exposure of information they want to keep private. The response letter was a masterpiece of legal strategy. It acknowledged the incident at Christmas dinner in factual terms, detailed the evidence supporting our account, and noted the pattern of similar incidents that had been documented by multiple witnesses over many years. It also informed Vanessa's attorney that we had evidence of commercial exploitation of our family without consent and were considering our own legal options. Most importantly, the letter made it clear that we weren't making public accusations or seeking media attention. We were simply sharing factual information with family members who needed it to protect their own children. If Vanessa wanted to make the situation public through legal proceedings, we were prepared to present our case in court with full documentation. The response to our letter was immediate silence. No calls from family members, no text messages, no social media activity from Vanessa's account. It was as if the entire Sterling family apparatus had suddenly gone dark while they figured out how to respond to a situation they couldn't control through their usual methods. But the silence was broken 3 days later by an unexpected development. I received a call from Jessica Chin, a producer at the network that had been considering Vanessa's reality show proposal. She'd somehow obtained information about recent events and wanted to discuss the situation with me directly. Miss Brooks, I'm calling because we've received some concerning information about your sister's family content and the authenticity of the relationships she's been documenting. Before we move forward with any business arrangements, we need to understand what actually happened during the filming session she submitted as part of her audition. I was careful to stick to facts during the conversation, confirming that the Christmas dinner had been filmed for commercial purposes, that there had been an incident involving my infant son, and that the family relationships portrayed in Vanessa's content didn't accurately reflect our actual dynamic. I didn't volunteer any inflammatory details, but I answered Jessica's questions honestly when she asked about specific aspects of the situation. Thank you for your honesty, Jessica said at the end of our conversation. This information is very helpful as we evaluate our programming decisions. Networks have to be extremely careful about liability issues, especially when children are involved in content creation. 2 hours later, my phone exploded with calls and messages from my family. Word had apparently gotten back to Vanessa that the network was conducting additional research into her background, and she was in full panic mode. Mom called, crying, begging me to contact the network and clarify that everything had been a misunderstanding. Dad sent multiple texts about the importance of family loyalty and the damage I was causing to Vanessa's dreams. But the most revealing response came from Vanessa herself, who showed up at our house unannounced that evening. David answered the door and found her standing on our porch with mascara streaks down her cheeks and her hands shaking with rage. "You destroyed everything," she screamed as soon as she saw me. "Years of work, hundreds of thousands of followers, business relationships I spent years building, all gone because you couldn't just let things go." "I didn't destroy anything, Vanessa. I protected my child and shared factual information with people who needed it. If that destroyed your business, maybe your business was built on lies." "It wasn't lies. It was content creation. It was storytelling. Everyone knows that social media isn't completely literal. It's about creating aspirational content that people want to engage with." David stepped between us, his posture making it clear that Vanessa needed to lower her voice and control her behavior. "You used our family as props for fictional content without our consent. And when our baby interfered with your production, you hit him. There's nothing aspirational about that. I barely touched him. And only because he was ruining months of work. Do you have any idea how hard it is to create authentic family content when people won't cooperate with the vision?" The admission was stunning. In her fury, Vanessa had revealed that she genuinely believed Lucas should have cooperated with her commercial filming and that striking him was justified by the importance of her content creation. She wasn't apologetic about hurting him. She was angry that he'd failed to perform according to her expectations. "Get off our property," David said quietly. "And don't come back. You can't just cut me out of the family. I'm Lucas's aunt." You have no rights to access a child you assaulted," David replied. "And if you come here again, I'll call the police." Vanessa's mask slipped completely in that moment. The polished influencer persona, the victim narrative, the claims of misunderstanding, all of it fell away to reveal someone who genuinely believed she was entitled to use our family for her purposes and that our refusal to cooperate was a betrayal of natural family obligation. She left screaming threats about lawsuits and family consequences, but her rage had actually strengthened our position. David had recorded the entire interaction on his phone, capturing her admission about using our family for content and her anger about Lucas not cooperating with filming. The recording provided clear evidence of her mindset and priorities. Evidence that would be devastating if she actually tried to pursue legal action. That night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Christmas dinner, complete certainty that we'd made the right choice. Vanessa's visit had stripped away any remaining doubt about her character or her commitment to changing her behavior. She wasn't sorry for hurting Lucas. She was angry that hurting Lucas had consequences. The war we'd been fighting wasn't really about one incident at Christmas dinner. It was about the right of children to be protected from adults who would harm them for personal gain, and the obligation of other adults to speak up when they witnessed abuse rather than protecting the abusers for the sake of family peace. We'd chosen protection over peace, truth over comfort, and our child's safety over our family's dysfunction. The consequences were painful, but they were also liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the obligation to manage other people's emotions at the expense of my own well-being and my child's safety. The battle was far from over, but we'd established clear boundaries and assembled the resources to defend them. Most importantly, we demonstrated to ourselves and our community that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was against people we'd once loved and trusted. Lucas would grow up in a family that prioritized his safety over social harmony, that valued truth over convenience, and that understood the difference between love and enabling. That was worth any price we had to pay to achieve. 6 months later, Lucas took his first steps in our backyard while David and I cheered from the patio. He wobbled between the garden bed and the fence, his face lit up with the pure joy of discovery. There were no cameras documenting the moment, no staged lighting to capture the perfect angle, no audience beyond the two people who loved him most. It was authentic in a way that Vanessa's manufactured family content never could be. The legal threats had evaporated after Vanessa's recorded admission about using our family for commercial purposes. Janet Morrison had crafted a settlement agreement that required all parties to maintain privacy about family matters while ensuring we could share safety information with relatives who had children. Vanessa agreed to seek counseling about appropriate boundaries with children, though I doubted she would follow through meaningfully. The reality show opportunity had disappeared entirely after the network conducted their background research. Jessica Chin later told me that they'd received multiple corroborating accounts about Vanessa's history with children, and the legal liability was too significant for them to move forward. The entertainment industry, despite its reputation for questionable ethics, drew hard lines around child safety issues. Mom and Dad had initially maintained their position that I was destroying the family over minor incidents blown out of proportion. But as more relatives came forward with their own experiences and memories, their narrative became increasingly difficult to sustain. Linda had organized a family meeting where several witnesses shared their accounts, creating a comprehensive picture that even my parents couldn't dismiss entirely. The meeting had been devastating for Mom, who genuinely seemed unaware of the extent of Vanessa's behavioral patterns. She'd spent years managing individual incidents as isolated problems, while missing the larger pattern that was obvious to everyone else. Dad characteristically had absorbed the information silently before retreating into his typical emotional withdrawal. Neither of my parents had apologized directly, but their approach had shifted from defending Vanessa to simply avoiding the topic entirely. They'd stopped pressuring me to reconcile, and had begun interacting with Lucas during brief supervised visits that felt stilted but safe. It wasn't the warm grandparent relationship I'd hoped for, but it was workable within our new boundaries. Vanessa herself had essentially disappeared from family dynamics. Her social media presence had shifted away from family content toward lifestyle and travel posts that didn't require authentic relationships. She'd apparently moved to Los Angeles to pursue other entertainment opportunities, though Linda reported that her follower engagement had dropped significantly after the authenticity of her content came into question. The most surprising development had been the response from extended family members. Several cousins and aunts had reached out to thank me for speaking up about issues they'd witnessed, but felt powerless to address. Sarah had become a close ally, often sharing parenting strategies and supporting each other through the complex process of setting boundaries with family members who'd proven unreliable. My cousin Marcus, who was Mom's nephew, had been particularly grateful for the information. He'd been planning to ask Vanessa to babysit his toddler during an upcoming family wedding, unaware of her history with children. "You probably prevented something terrible from happening," he told me during a phone conversation. "I can't thank you enough for having the courage to speak up." The military community at Fort Henderson had rallied around us in ways that demonstrated the difference between chosen family and biological family. Colonel Martinez had personally ensured that David faced no professional consequences for the situation, and several of our friends had shared their own experiences with cutting contact with toxic family members. Captain Torres and his wife Maria had become particularly close friends, often joining us for dinners and weekend activities that felt genuinely relaxed and supportive. Their children played well with Lucas, and we'd begun creating the kind of authentic family traditions that Vanessa had been manufacturing for social media consumption. "You know what I love about our gatherings?" Maria had observed during a recent barbecue. "Nobody's performing. Nobody's managing anyone else's emotions. We're just enjoying each other's company without agenda or drama." Dr. Walsh had continued monitoring Lucas's development and had been pleased to note no lasting effects from the Christmas dinner incident. At his one-year checkup, she'd commented on his secure attachment and confident exploration of new environments. Children are resilient when they have consistent, protective caregivers, she'd said. Lucas clearly knows he's safe with you. The observation had meant more to me than any family reconciliation could have. We'd prioritized Lucas's well-being over social expectations, and he was thriving as a result. His trust in us was complete because we'd proven ourselves trustworthy through our actions rather than our words. David had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, partly based on his leadership during what his superiors characterized as a complex family crisis that required protecting dependent family members while maintaining professional obligations. His commanding officers had specifically noted his integrity in handling a situation where many people might have chosen easier paths that compromised child safety. The promotion had validated our decision-making in ways that felt deeply satisfying. The military valued the same principles we'd applied to our family situation, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, maintaining clear boundaries, and refusing to compromise core values for social convenience. I'd started volunteering with a family advocacy program on base, helping other military spouses navigate difficult situations with civilian family members who didn't understand military life or values. Many of the women I worked with had experienced similar conflicts between loyalty to birth families and protection of their children or spouses. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply meaningful. I'd learned to recognize the signs of gaslighting and manipulation that I'd missed in my own situation, and I could help other women trust their instincts when family members tried to undermine their judgment about safety issues. One young mother, Angela, had been struggling with in-laws who consistently undermined her parenting decisions and criticized her husband's military career. After several sessions, she decided to limit their access to her children rather than continuing to manage their emotional needs at her family's expense. I kept thinking I was being too sensitive or too protective, she told me after implementing new boundaries. But watching how they treated my concerns made me realize that people who truly cared about my children would respect my judgment as their parent. The parallels to my own experience were striking, and helping other women navigate similar challenges had reinforced my confidence in the choices we'd made. Family relationships that required sacrificing child safety or personal integrity weren't worth preserving, regardless of blood connections or social expectation. Linda had become an unexpected source of ongoing support, often calling to check on how we were adjusting to life without the sterling family drama. She'd revealed that she'd been considering speaking up about Vanessa's behavior for years, but had never found the courage until she saw what happened to Lucas. Watching you stand up for your baby gave me permission to finally tell the truth about things I've been keeping quiet about for decades, she told me during one of our conversations. Sometimes it takes one person being brave enough to break the silence before others can find their voice. Linda had also provided updates about how Mom and Dad were processing the situation. They'd apparently begun attending counseling together, trying to understand how they'd enabled harmful behavior for so many years. The process was painful but necessary if they wanted to have any kind of relationship with their grandchildren going forward. Your mother is starting to understand that protecting Vanessa from consequences didn't actually help anyone, including Vanessa, Linda had reported. It's taken her this long to realize that love sometimes means allowing people to face the results of their choices. The insight about consequences versus enablement had been crucial for my own healing process. For years, I'd confused accommodation with love, thinking that protecting family members from uncomfortable realities was kindness rather than harm. Learning to distinguish between support and enabling had changed how I approached all my relationships. Lucas's first birthday party had been a celebration of authentic family bonds rather than obligatory social connections. We'd invited the Fort Henderson friends who'd become our chosen family, along with Linda and a few cousins who'd supported us throughout the crisis. The gathering was small but genuine, filled with people who truly cared about Lucas's well-being rather than their own image. Silence and family that earns your trust. May he always know the difference between love that protects and love that enables. The contrast with previous family celebrations was stark. There was no performing for cameras, no managing someone else's emotional needs, no walking on eggshells to avoid triggering drama. Lucas played freely with the other children, while adults had relaxed conversations about real topics rather than surface-level pleasantries designed to avoid conflict. As I watched our son interact with people who genuinely cared about him, I felt deep gratitude for the choice we'd made to prioritize substance over appearance. He was growing up surrounded by adults who modeled healthy boundaries, authentic communication, and unwavering commitment to child protection. The most surprising gift had come from an unexpected source. Eleanor's sister, Margaret, who was 93 and lived in an assisted living facility in Portland, had heard about our situation through family channels and requested a visit. When we'd driven up to meet her, she'd shared stories about Eleanor that put our choices in historical context. Eleanor always said that family isn't about blood connections or social obligations, Margaret had told us while Lucas played with toys she'd saved from her own children's childhood. She said family is about people who show up for each other when it matters, who tell the truth even when it's difficult, and who protect those who can't protect themselves. Margaret had also revealed that Eleanor had been concerned about Vanessa's behavior with children for years before her death. She'd apparently tried to address the issue with Mom and Dad, but had been dismissed as an interfering older relative who didn't understand modern parenting approaches. Eleanor would be proud of what you did, Margaret had said as we prepared to leave. She always believed that protecting children was more important than maintaining comfortable lives. You honored her values even when your own parents wouldn't. The validation from Eleanor's sister had felt like receiving a blessing from beyond the grave. Eleanor had always been the family member who combined unconditional love with clear expectations for management. David had given a toast that brought tears to my eyes, to Lucas, who taught us the difference between family that demands your appropriate behavior. Learning that she would have supported our choices provided deep comfort during moments when I questioned whether we'd been too harsh or unforgiving. Now, watching Lucas navigate our backyard with the confidence of a child who'd never doubted his safety, I understood that we'd given him something invaluable. The security of knowing that the adults in his life would always prioritize his well-being over social convenience. David joined me on the patio as Lucas discovered a butterfly near the roses. Our son's delighted laughter filled the air as he tried to follow the butterfly's erratic flight pattern, stumbling occasionally, but always getting back up with determination. Any regrets? David asked quietly, though I could tell from his tone that he already knew my answer. None, I replied, watching Lucas's pure joy in the simple pleasure of chasing a butterfly. Look at him. He's fearless because he knows he's protected. He's curious because he's never been punished for being a normal child. He's confident because he's never been told that his needs don't matter. David nodded, understanding the deeper implications of what we'd chosen. He'll grow up knowing that love means protection, not accommodation. That family means safety, not obligation. That his worth isn't negotiable, even with people who share his DNA. The lessons we've learned through crisis had become the foundation for the family culture we were building. Lucas would understand that healthy relationships required mutual respect, that boundaries were expressions of self-care rather than selfishness, and that sometimes love meant saying no to people who demanded harmful compliance. As the sun set behind the trees, and Lucas finally tired himself out chasing butterflies, I felt complete peace with the choices we'd made. We'd traded the familiar dysfunction of my birth family for the uncertain work of building authentic relationships, and the trade had been more than worth it. Lucas would never remember the Christmas dinner that changed everything. But he would grow up with the benefits of our decision to prioritize his safety over family harmony. And he would know that his parents could be trusted to protect him, that his needs mattered, and that love never required accepting harm from others. The war that had begun with a slapped baby had ended with a victory that mattered most, a child who was safe, loved, and free to develop his own authentic self without performing for other people's emotional needs. In losing my birth family, I gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that I could build the kind of family that actually deserved the name.